Hi.
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 Hello.
I'm curious about...
I'm curious about
building open, authentic, loving relationship.
I'm curious about jealousy.
I'm curious about polyamory.
Does it just mean that you're fucking all the time?
How can I tell my parents that my partner is already married?
I'm curious about...
How do you know when you're too busy to have another relationship?
I'm curious about dominant and subordinate relationships.
I'm curious about sexual health.
How can relationships evolve with people as they grow and change?
Welcome to the Curious Folks podcast for those challenging the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. My name is Effy Blue.
And I'm Jacqueline Misla. And today we're talking about evolutionary psychology and challenging the idea that we have complete free will when choosing lovers, partners, and relationship structures. So, how much does evolutionary wiring impact the types of relationships we seek? And what does the behavior of our relatives from 1 million years ago have to do with our relationship choices today? Well, our guide in helping us sort out which decisions are rooted in our source code and where we exert our individual interest is Dr. Adar Eisenbruch. Adar is an evolutionary psychologist who has a PhD in psychological and brain science from the University of California. He completed his postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University and has been an associate researcher at Future Laboratories, a visiting assistant professor at SUNY Purchase, and is currently assistant professor at Mount St. Mary College in New York. His research centers around cooperation, friendship, and behavioral endocrinology. And before the pandemic put us all in lockdown, he did a talk on the chemistry of chemistry, how hormones affect romance and relationships.
Evolutionary psychology is probably my number one area of interest when it comes to relationships. I think it is fascinating. When we think about evolution, we think of Darwin, and mostly biological evolution, right? If you Google evolution and take a look at the images, you get the super familiar meme of the outline of the monkey into the human, which represents over 6 million year period. But our psychology has evolved equally. This is to say, a lot and not that much at the same time. I can't wait to delve into this conversation with Adar, an evolutionary psychologist, about how the way we think about relationships today is impacted by our ancestors. And we start with asking, what exactly is evolutionary psychology? We hope you enjoy the interview.
It is a type of psychology, a branch of psychology, sort of like developmental psychology or social psychology, except it's a little bit different because it's not a list of topics. If you look at, what developmental psychologists study or what social psychologists study, there's kind of a list of topics that is included in each of those domains of psychology. Evolutionary psychology is not actually a topic area or a list of topic areas. It's an approach that can be used to study any topic within psychology. So it's really just fundamentally trying to understand human behavior, the design of the human mind from an evolutionary point of view, kind of looking at the ways that humans think and humans behave and say, okay, well, in an evolutionary sense, why is it like that? Why do we have those preferences or those particular behaviors or thought patterns? How did those things evolve? What's their function? And we can kind of do it in the opposite direction of, we can take what we know about evolutionary psychology, so the problems our ancestors had to solve, the type of worlds that they lived in, and think, okay, well, given that evolutionary history that we know about, what would we predict the human mind is like? And we can then test those predictions. So it's really using evolution to understand the human mind and human behavior better, but that can be applied to any topic. So there's evolutionary social psychology, evolutionary developmental psychology, evolutionary cognitive psychology, because it's just applying that evolutionary approach to any of those topics.
One of the things I'm interested in is that there is real tension, I think, right now in society around the distinction of us being autonomous, free beings, unique, can create our own paths in life. And there's real knowledge that we are products of our upbringing, of our culture, of our parents, of our history, of our lineage, of our DNA. And so I'm wondering, in the work that you've been doing and kind of seeing this tension, if there's been anything that has actually surprised you in this work and thought like, oh, all right, well, I guess I didn't create that. I guess that came from.
Right. That's interesting. And that's a really, really profound question. I mean, I wouldn't say that there's anything that has surprised me. I think I came into doing this work very much like as a materialist. Like I kind of, I believe in a material universe. I think that applies to the human mind and human brain as well. Like we are machines. I believe in sort of like a mechanistic understanding of the human mind. So in that sense, I think I don't have the same discomfort that you have with like, oh my gosh, can I be predicted mechanistically? I have come into this work thinking like, yeah, totally. Like I can be predicted mechanistically in the same way that like, so can a dog or a fish or a squirrel. I think to some degree, what maybe has surprised me is when I started doing this work, I had a little concern, and I sort of heard a concern from other people of like, but isn't this going to ruin it? Like, if you know how the magic trick works, if you know why relationships function the way they do, if you know why you like the things that you like, won't that kind of ruin the experience of it? Because you'll feel like, oh, I don't really love this person. It's just this like chemical cascade in my brain.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it was a concern, but I was kind of curious to see like what happens to the magic tricks when you study the magic. And I'm pleased to report, at least in my own personal experience, like it doesn't ruin it at all. It's interesting how you can totally, you can both be a scientist about things like social relationships and emotions and social preferences, but then just also live in those relationships and preferences and emotions. And it just totally works. And it doesn't, to some degree, it makes no difference at all. There's some areas where I think maybe it a little bit deepens my appreciation of those things, because I have this feeling of like, wow, like the machinery is really good. Yes, this is produced by biological and cognitive machinery. And you know what? The machinery works. Like it's amazing. It is really, really good. Like I understand that I've evolved to be tricked into loving my child, and it's implemented by these chemicals in my brain. But guess what? It really works.
It feels so real.
It works. Like the machine. I feel like there's a sense of like, does becoming a magician ruin magic tricks for you? I think probably not. I think if you're a magician and then you watch another great magician perform, it's not ruined. It's the opposite. It's even better. You're just like, oh my gosh, they did that so well. Like the craftsmanship is terrific. Yeah. And I feel that way about all these evolved structures where it's like, sure, like I'm being duped by my genes into loving my offspring, but boy, are they doing a good job.
And I do love that child with all my being.
I love the child. It works perfectly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I like when I hear you talk about that, it is music to my ears, because this is kind of how that's how I look at all of this. We tend to specialize more in love, sex, and relationship things, and I especially really focus on the relationship side of things. And the way that you think of the human as a machine is similar to the way that I think about it. And when we talked before, I shared with this idea that I think of it as like our source code, that the source code that we all have that is evolved over 6 million years, that is still running.
Much more. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's still running, and it's still very effective. And we can, we still get to write new pieces of software, but the source code is the source code, and it's been around for a very long time. And I'm curious to how much does evolutionary wiring, that source code, if you will, impact the types of relationships that we seek?
I think it impacts it profoundly. Like, for example, okay, humans generally, not 100% of people, but like generally speaking, we are motivated to form romantic relationships, right? Romantic attachments, adults at least. And that's not true of every species, right? Like turtles don't do that. Squirrels don't do that. Dogs don't do that. A lot of birds don't do that. Like that is not inevitable in any kind of like physical sense. There's no law of the universe that says every organism has to have romantic relationships. But for humans, it is totally common and normal and typical. And there's some variation in what those attachments look like and how people navigate them, which is what you guys explore so often. But just the general premise of like romance is a thing, romantic relationships are a thing, that is a function of human evolution, right? We have evolved to crave those relationships, to find it intuitive to enter those relationships. There are certain features of the relationships that are very, very common and recurrent that are there because of our evolution, because of sort of the source code as you're talking about it, like the feeling of possessiveness that often exists within romantic relationships. Again, that's not a law of the universe, right? Dogs don't do that. Squirrels don't do that. Fish don't do that. But humans do. And like you guys often talk about, there are different ways of handling those feelings of possessiveness. There are different ways of managing them. You know, there's some variation there. But just this basic thing that is kind of a like broad strokes truism of human relationships, which is we have romantic attachments, and very often feelings of possessiveness are part of those romantic attachments. That's because of how we evolved. Like it didn't come from anywhere else. That's because of how we evolved. So I think the impact on the types of relationships we seek, romantic relationships, friendships, alliances, ongoing family relationships, like these sort of intergenerational relationships that are not just for infants, right? Like they continue for decades and decades and decades. And that's kind of feels natural to us, right? All of those things are very much the result of our having evolved as hunter-gatherers who live in these kind of semi-nomadic bands, who have incredibly, incredibly helpless young, who stay helpless for an incredibly, incredibly long time. And all of those features of our evolutionary history have produced these relationship templates and relationship motivations in our minds that now we are living out, we're acting out. So I think the impact of our evolutionary history on our kind of social minds and social lives is profound. But I do just want to qualify that in one sense. That doesn't mean that there aren't also contemporary influences, like the effect of experiences you have had growing up, or experiences you've had in your prior relationships, or the things you've learned from other people, or the things you've learned from your culture. Evolution is not mutually exclusive with those other influences. Those other things are very, very much real. And in fact, we might be able to understand in part why they have the effect that they have from an evolutionary perspective, right? Maybe culture has the effect that it has because we have evolved to pay attention to our culture. We have evolved to, learn from what other people are doing and maybe to some degree copy them. So yeah, I don't think we can possibly understand our social minds and social lives and social worlds without thinking about evolution. But it's not a question of crowding out other explanations. I think it's really a matter of enriching those other explanations as well.
Everything that you said, I'm like, wow, there's like so many different pathways of my brain.
My mind.
I know, my brain is just like split into a million questions of like, what about this? What about this? What about this?
Yeah.
And it's kind of circular, right? The more I sort of follow the logic as you were talking of how our evolution affects our everyday today, to how our everyday is affected by our evolution, and things like economics, for example, has a huge impact in the way that we I think remain in relationships, and the sort of power dynamics and systemic dynamics, all that kind of stuff affects our relationships. But the way that it affects the relationships, the way we react to it, is also sort of circles back into evolutionary psychology. So it's this like circles that go around circles. So as you were talking, I was just like following these logic trails, and I was like, whoa, it's like one big circle that is made of other circles,
That's making me think about, in connection to relationships, that it feels like sometimes the answer is attraction or hormones, right? And like, that's the thing. And I'm wondering if you can kind of dissect that a little bit too. Like what is it that makes us attracted to people, or that the hormones that impact romance and relationships? Those sound like, oh, that's the answer now, and we're done and close the book. And I'm wondering if you can now reopen that book and explain a little bit more for us.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's a great question because, why do you want to be friends with that person? Or why do you want to be, in a romantic relationship with that person? And it seems like the answer could just be like, well, because I like them, like, because they're attractive and I just like them and I want to. And like subjectively, that just feels like the entire answer. But of course, we can peel back the curtain a little bit and see, the mechanism producing that attraction, the mechanism producing that liking, and kind of see what the traits are a little bit. So for, let's say, physical attractiveness, we know a lot now about kind of what the traits are that make someone physically attractive. We can best understand this by understanding it from an evolutionary perspective, right? We evolved to prefer these particular traits in different types of partners. So those traits are things like symmetry, like the symmetry of your face, the symmetry of your body. So humans, generally speaking, have what's called bilateral symmetry, which is that like the left side and the right side are more or less the same. But of course, in each person, they are not perfectly the same. There are slight asymmetries in pretty much everything on your body. However, the degree of asymmetry reveals what scientists call developmental stability. The idea being that what produces the asymmetries is these little diseases, infections, any kind of like glitches in the sort of the expression of that genetic program that produces those asymmetries. So when you look at the degree to which someone is symmetrical or asymmetrical, you're kind of getting like a little window into the past. You're getting a window into their development, and you can assess to what degree they experience those developmental instabilities. And of course, what allows someone to resist the developmental instabilities, like fighting off the pathogen or fighting off the disease instead of being affected by it, would be the quality of their immune system, which, to some degree now is revealing genetic quality. So we prefer symmetrical people. We experience that feeling, we experience that preference of looking at someone symmetrical, we experience it as just attraction, right? Like they're hot, or I can't put my finger on why, but I just like want to talk to them. I want to be friends with them. Like they look cool, they look good. Because over our evolutionary history, that symmetry revealed a person's value as a social partner, as a mate, and also just as like a cooperative partner and an ally and a friend. So that's why we now have that preference. And we can do a similar analysis for things like hormone markers. So when you're looking at someone's face, to some degree, you're looking at, or not looking at their hormone levels, but you can implicitly estimate their hormone levels, right? You're looking at the effects that their hormone levels had on them as they were growing. And so, okay, why would people prefer, let's say, testosterone-y men and estrogen-y women? Well, for estrogen, it reveals fertility. So there's a pretty straightforward account of why people would have evolved to prefer highly fertile women as mates. For men, testosterone predicts things like dominance and resource control. So if those are traits that were valuable to women seeking a mate over evolutionary history, or also to other men seeking allies or cooperative partners over evolutionary history, then that explains why traits that reveal testosterone would be attractive now. So we can do this kind of evolutionary analysis for all the traits that make people attractive, and I think it really helps us understand it. So just to give you like the speed run through of the other things that are found attractive, averageness, physical averageness, like having facial features that are sort of close to the population average. So not having a super unusual nose or super unusual mouth, stuff like that, being kind of like close to species typical in your features is generally found attractive. Cues of health, just like looking healthy. You don't have lesions on your skin. You don't have open rashes on your skin. That's generally found attractive. If we look at bodies, for men's bodies, kind of moderate muscularity tend to be found most attractive. So definitely some muscularity, but there is such a thing, at least from a mate choice perspective, there is such a thing as too muscular. And if you think about muscularity as revealing testosterone, this kind of makes sense because there is such a thing as too much testosterone, right? Like testosterone can be useful if it promotes social dominance and resource control. But there is such a thing as too much dominance, right? Someone can become volatile or dangerous or a bad partner if they're too dominant. If you think about women's bodies and what makes them attractive for men, things like a low waist to hip ratio. This is psychologists speak for an hourglass figure, but psychologists call it a low waist to hip ratio. So this reveals, it's actually really interesting. It reveals deposits of these very, very special fats that women store in their hips and glutes and thighs. It's these long chain fatty acids. So like, omega-3s and stuff like that are really important for fetal and infant brain development. Those particular fats are important for building brains. Over evolutionary time, women who had, ample stores of those fats were able to donate more of those fats to their children over the course of gestation and nursing. So presumably their children got smarter. And that's how that, preference came to be.
I'm wondering if there's research around how that impacts folks who are attracted to the same sex, where heterosexual procreation is not front of mind, or maybe it is behind the scenes, again, when you pull back the curtain. But I'm wondering if there's any research around the distinction there.
Yeah, that's such a good question, right? So everything I've just been discussing sort of assumes, heterosexuality as kind of like the background against which, these preferences would evolve. And to my knowledge, there might be other people who are more expert in this. To my knowledge, understanding just homosexuality in general and the preferences that gay people have or bi people or pan people is a big open question. I think there's a real mystery there of like, do gay men, for example, have women's preferences? They're just showing up in a man? Or do gay men have men's preferences? They're just being applied to men instead of applied to women, or something in the middle, or some combination thereof. And I'm sure there are individual differences there as well. Yeah, that's just a really good question. I have no idea. I think there's like a lot that we could understand and don't understand about that.
My guess is that a lot of this is solving for survival of the species, right? It's about the offspring. And I think with same-sex couples, same-sex attraction, you're taking out that piece, the natural offspring. I think when you take that out, then it becomes this like, but then why, right? It's almost like you have to step back even further to understand the evolution of homosexuality, how it fits into the big picture. I don't think you can apply the same science and the reasoning and the problem solving to homosexual couples, to heterosexual couples, would be my guess.
Yeah, so I think I disagree with you of like, well, you can't apply the same evolutionary reasoning because gay couples aren't reproducing. So all of these explanations that are sort of like about reproduction don't make sense. I actually want to push back on that a little bit. I think there's a sense in which gay people's preferences are actually really spectacular evidence of the fact that these preferences are evolved. Because let's take preferences that reveal someone's fertility. You could, so like men's preferences about women, for example, if that reveals fertility, you could kind of try to make an argument that those preferences are not there because they evolved. They're just there because people want to reproduce. Somehow people found out what predicts a person's ability to reproduce. So now they're attracted to those traits that will facilitate reproduction. To be clear, I don't think this is a good argument. It's a losing argument, but you could make that argument, right? However, now with gay couples, or actually similarly straight couples that just don't want to have kids and are going to spend their whole lives using contraception to not have kids, we're taking away the kind of reproductive logic. So you might think then, well, if evolution has nothing to do with it, and we take away the reproductive logic, then there's no reason for gay couples or non-reproducing straight couples to prefer those traits that were reproductively valuable to our ancestors, right? There's no reason then for people who are attracted to women to prefer women who look fertile or who look like they have, those special long chain fatty acids to donate to their offspring, right? It's just useless at that point. And yet those traits are still attractive, right? Those preferences are still there. So I think, in fact, we can look at gay people's preferences or non-reproducing straight people's preferences and notice, hey, they still kind of like a lot of the same stuff, right? They're still looking for symmetry and muscularity and low waist-hip ratio. Well, why would that be? I think the best explanation is because those preferences have just evolved. That's just like part of the human, like you like to call it, Effy, part of the human source code, right? Like we come factory loaded with those preferences. Even if you're not going to use those preferences for reproducing, they're still there.
My question then goes to, how do we then explain things like the ever-changing contemporary beauty standards, right? So if you look at, for example, let's look at Vogue over the decades, and what you see is ever-changing beauty standards for women, right? So you have the 50s, you have the hourglass figures, then women become very skinny, and then women become very athletic. We're trying to move away from the beauty standards, and we try to have diversity in that. So there isn't like the one image. So I'm curious to if our evolution have given us these preferences that is sort of built in, then how do we come up with the contemporary beauty standards? How is that decided, and how does that affect in the way we see what is beautiful?
Your question's really, really terrific. I think the answer to the question is a little bit to push back on the premise. So I think that obviously there are some cultural differences in, criteria of attractiveness. To some degree, fashions change over time, right? Like, are we into skinny jeans or are we into bell bottoms? But I actually think if you zoom out a little bit, there's an incredible amount of constancy and uniformity in what's actually found attractive. So yes, the weight of Vogue models and Playboy Playmates has changed a little bit, and some of those fashions that we've talked about has changed a little bit. But actually, there's also a ton that isn't changing. It's all symmetrical people who look really healthy, who are reproductive age, but young within that reproductive career, right? It's still just like women in their like early 20s. We're still, we're not getting lots of 75-year-olds on the cover of Vogue or on the cover of Playboy. There was actually some really interesting research looking at weight or like body shape, body type preferences, looking at Playboy Playmates as kind of an interesting proxy for men's preferences. And it's true that the weight of Playboy Playmates has fluctuated over time, mostly gone down, but their waist to hip ratio hasn't changed. It's still this 0.7 waist to hip ratio.
Wow.
So even though the weight's changing, the body shape is really constant. Yeah. So I kind of think because we're swimming in this culture, it's really easy for us to look at these fashions and go, oh my God, everything changes so much. It's all so variable. But I think if you zoom out and look at humans the way like alien researchers would look at humans if they were hovering over Earth, they'd be like, they all look the same. Like what they like is all the same. Yeah. All these magazine covers basically have the same person on them. Like we get it, like symmetrical young women over and over and over, and there's some evidence as well suggesting the universality of these preferences. So there's been research looking at attractiveness judgments across cultures. Like, do people in different cultures, including non-Western cultures, including non-capitalistic cultures, do they actually agree on who's attractive? And it turns out the answer is yes. People cross-culturally agree on who's attractive and who isn't. There's been really cool work looking at infants and newborns and showing that they distinguish between faces that adults find more attractive and less attractive. So newborns will actually look longer at faces that humans consider attractive faces compared to less attractive faces. And presumably the newborns haven't been reading a lot of Vogue. So this preference is coming from somewhere. We kind of, it seems like evolution's like the only real plausible explanation.
So it turns out Tinder is a great tool.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Tinder got it right. Here we go.
They got it
The
right.
conclusion is Tinder got it right.
Right. Take really symmetrical looking photos for your Tinder profile.
Definitely.
Note the body shape.
Right.
But what I love about this conversation is I think it highlights what we were talking about in the beginning, our resistance to believing that things are evolutionary and pre-described, right? Because you were like, this is what people find attractive. I'm like, but what about gay people? And then Effy is like, but what about our fashion changes? And what about, and you're like, still though, but still, like you keep, and I think that really highlights that push and pull. And one of the things I'm curious about is the distinction between nature, nurture, neither, both. It sounds like in what you're describing, it is about both, that it is our nature that evolves within our nurture, and that our preferences at the time may be more nurture culture related, but really still rooted in our nature. So it feels like it's all tied together. I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
So I'm actually really happy that you asked about nature versus nurture, because I love to talk about it. Not because I think it's a good question, but because I think it's a terrible question that needs to die now. It's a stupid question. So I'm really happy if I can sort of drive a stake into the heart of the nature versus nurture debate. Because here's what I think happens. People talk about nature versus nurture, and implicit in the question is this idea that those are separate things. Those are different and separate effects. So we can somehow tell the difference between the effect of nature and the effect of nurture, and those effects operate independently. So then, we bring up this nature versus nurture debate, and people think, well, the kind of like smart answer, the educated answer is both. Of course, both. Of course, we've evolved certain things, and of course we learn certain things. But I still don't like the both answer, because it retains this assumption that those things are separate in the first place, and you can just like layer them on top of each other like peanut butter on top of jelly. But the problem is that nature and nurture do not operate independently. You cannot have the effect of one without the effect of the other. They only operate in interaction with each other.
Mm-hmm.
If you pulled out the environment, the evolved mechanisms would do nothing whatsoever. And if you pulled out the evolved mechanisms, the environment would do nothing whatsoever. So, to me, like nature versus nurture is a little bit like, what makes your car go? The engine or the gasoline? It's like, it's both, but saying both kind of like overlooks the fact that they're working together. It's one system. So I think we kind of need to totally bury the nature versus nurture question and start focusing on like, how do nature and nurture interact? Like, what are the evolved mechanisms, the nature that interacts in particular ways with particular aspects of the environment, the nurture, to produce whatever outcomes we're interested in? Jackie, thank you for asking that stupid question.
Terrible.
Exactly, right, exactly.
It's good. I think it's such an ongoing. I love that we debunked like the question, right? It's like
right.
we're not anymore gonna ask that question.
If I could make one difference in the world through this podcast, it's that I want people to just reject the question as ill-formed.
I love it.
Love
That's great. Okay, so let me, with all this information, especially about, evolution and the attractiveness, I want to kind of pull us more towards the relationship side of things, right? So one of the conversations we continue to have on this podcast and discussions is a relationship structure, right? What we advocate here is that there are many different relationship structures, and we talk a lot about, especially my work is really around this idea of relationship by design, right? That we should actively and dynamically and consciously design our relationships in a way that we as the individuals in the relationship can thrive, right? And which always leaves the door open to monogamy versus non-monogamy, whichever works for you. And then if it is non-monogamy, what is it going to look like? Because non-monogamy can come in so many different shapes and forms. You can also argue that monogamy can come in different shapes and sizes. So it's just about figuring out what are the conditions in which you're going to thrive, and how do those conditions translate into a relationship structure that will work for you, right? That you can sustain and thrive in. So that's the way kind of we approach it. I am curious if, from an evolutionary psychology point of view, is there an optimum relationship structure? Is monogamy as kind of hardwired into us, is a big part of our source code as it seems? Is non-monogamy absolutely ludicrous, or is there room for both? Do you have any insight into that?
Wow. Those are tough questions. I mean, so I think it's pretty clear that non-monogamy is not ludicrous, right? Because people do it and it makes some people happy. Some people do it really successfully, right? So there's nothing ludicrous about that. However, it also seems pretty evident that monogamy is a little bit of a default relationship structure for humans. And this makes perfect sense if you look at our offspring, right? Like, children need so much parenting for so long that doing it alone is just not going to be as easy or likely to be as successful as doing it as a team. So this idea of like the way that humans reproduce is by forming parenting teams that kind of like consistently co-parent with each other makes an enormous amount of sense. So we need to find some way to kind of like negotiate that tension, that gray area, you know, the tension between this idea of like pair bonding. I'm not saying necessarily perfect monogamy, but some kind of like commitment, pair bonded relationship that is probably to some degree like exclusive and possessive, right? Like another person is a resource, and it makes sense that people would want to kind of like monopolize that resource within a relationship. So that idea of like these possessive bonded relationships seems to be in many respects like a default for us. At the same time, clearly we can do other stuff, and some people want to do other stuff. So like, how do we negotiate that tension? I think to some degree, the way to do it is by just understanding like what the kind of like the tripwires or the sore spots are within our evolved relationship psychology, because then they can be managed around and negotiated. So like by analogy, humans have evolved to eat meat because meat's a really good source of nutrition. So we've like very clearly evolved to eat meat. But I've been a vegetarian for over a decade. So clearly there are, you know, options where you can do the things you haven't evolved to do, but you're going to have to be conscious of the fact of like, oh, well, I still need certain nutrients, and like a steak is still going to smell really, really good to me. So like, I'm going to need some ways of managing those things. So I think within a relationship, I think jealousy is going to be a big part of it. I know you guys sometimes talk about jealousy. I think the way to understand jealousy is not as a bug in the system, as, you know, this kind of like annoying bug that now like gets in the way of all of our non-monogamous dreams. I think jealousy is a feature of the system. Jealousy evolved for good reason. You know, it makes sense that if you are relying on another person to be your co-parent for years and years and decades, you would want to monopolize that resource and kind of defend it from other people, right? You don't want other people taking those resources from your partner that should be going to you. You don't want other people occupying your partner's womb when you were assuming you were going to get to use it and you've been, you know, investing in those offspring, right? Like sort of this sense of protecting resources is totally a feature of the system. And that's kind of what jealousy evolved to do. It evolved to protect these like valued social resources. So I think understanding that jealousy is going to be there and understanding what triggers jealousy. A partner having sex with someone else. Is it a partner giving gifts to someone else or having emotional intimacy with someone else? I think, you know, if you're kind of, Effy, like you're saying, like designing a relationship, I think to some degree, those are like the rocks under the water that you're going to need to design around. And evolutionary psychology can help with that a little bit. Like, what makes people jealous? It turns out that men are more sort of like possessive and jealous regarding their partner having sex with someone else. Women are more possessive and jealous regarding like emotional intimacy and cues that their partner's resources might be diverted to someone else. So those are, you know, that's what you have to design around. Those are the challenges that should be anticipated and I think not resented, but appreciated. Like, those are great things. Our mind is doing the right thing there. But now, we live in the 21st century and just kind of want to do something else with it. Fine, that's great. But like, those are the rocks under the water that I think you need to navigate around.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's so much there. Yeah.
So interesting. There are many episodes that we do where I have to like re-listen to it for a few times or like sit with it. And this feels like one of those things where now I want to sit back and be like, okay, where am I leaning into default setting? Where am I making decisions to rewrite some of the code? The last thing that we want to do is explore some of our curiosity with you.
Okay.
And so we have 4 rapid fire questions that we want to ask you, so that before we leave this episode, we can learn a little bit more about what's going on in your head. You explain to us what's happening in all of our minds.
Right.
I want to understand a little bit more what's going on in yours. So the first question that we have for you is, what is one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self about love, sex, or relationships?
It's a little bit of a hard question because to some degree, I feel like I'm pretty happy with where I am now. So I feel like don't change anything. Like,
that's good advice.
Don't
keep going.
Disrupt, like just stay that course because like it's good now. But I actually do think, thinking back on some relationships I had earlier in my life, romantic relationships, I something that happened to me over and over is I had this feeling of like being trapped either by my own choices or trapped by the other person's choices. Oh my God, they just like moved across the country to be with me. Like now I'm obligated to stay with them or be nice to them or something like that. Yeah. Or even just trapped by like what my notion of love and romance was at the time. Like I think I had an idea of martyrdom a little bit like baked into my concept of romance, of like part of what it means to like love someone is, you're a martyr to them and to the relationship. And looking back on it, I kind of just feel like, let's just chuck that, like, just kind of get out of those relationships a little bit sooner. I think, this idea of like relationships involving martyrdom, I don't know if I want to get rid of entirely, right? We all make sacrifices for our partners. That's not a bad thing all the time. But that feeling of like, like I love someone and that means I can never break up with them, I kind of think is not a particularly useful notion. So I would tell my younger self to just kind of like not worry about that so much. Relationships end. That's fine.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Good advice for sure. Okay, what is one romantic or sexual adventure on your bucket list?
One of these days I would just really love to try sex.
Just get laid once or twice.
I'm glad you laughed. I'm glad you got the joke.
I can hear your kids in the background, so
exactly.
Oh yeah, do you hear them? Okay, good.
That was the clue.
For the joke, right? Yeah, that was the clue. Yeah, I don't know if I have a real answer to that. I don't know. I've just never been like a bucket list person. I don't know.
I like it. Live in the moment. Do the thing. I like it. Okay, so how do you challenge the status quo?
For me, it's teaching, right? Because like I'm a psychology professor, so I'm teaching lots of students in intro psych, in evolutionary psych, social psych, developmental psych, and I try to kind of teach them this like evolutionary way of looking at all these features of psychology and ways of looking at their own lives. And like we talked about, like, it's not always the most intuitive way of looking at things. It's not our default to say, why do I like that person? We just like them and go with it. So I think my little mission is to get more people to think about themselves as evolved organisms and understand themselves that way, and just kind of like take that out into the world with them wherever it goes. I just want them to kind of think that way more, which from my experience is definitely not the way people typically come into my classroom thinking.
And to get all of us to stop asking about nature and nurture.
Yes, there we go. That's it. I just want to kill that question.
Yeah, that would be your lifelong achievement, to get people to stop that.
Yes,
nice.
Exactly.
Okay, and what are you curious about lately?
Oh, okay. Well, so since you can hear my kid in the background, that's a good segue. I mean, for me, it's like, it's kind of parenthood and what that means in terms of my life, my relationship with my wife. I kind of feel like that's sort of like the next chapter, like I was single when I was younger. My wife and I were together for a long time before we had a kid. So I kind of feel like I know what those things are like. And now we have a kid. And that to me just feels a little bit like a new frontier of romance and relationship and family, and just thinking about everything is a little bit different. And, there's some loss in that, of course, but there's also a lot to be gained. You lose some of the like spontaneity and stuff like that, but there's a lot of like, even just thinking about my relationship with my wife, there's also a lot of like intimacy and appreciation that gets gained by kind of having everything in this context of parenting. So I'm just kind of curious about like what that chapter is going to be like. How does that play out? That just seems like the next frontier in my life is being, a husband, a lover, all these things, but also while being a dad. And I don't know exactly what's going to happen there. So I'm just kind of curious to see where that goes.
Nice. It's a cool adventure. Having been in a few feet ahead of you on the journey. It's a pretty cool adventure. Yeah.
Yeah. So far, so good.
Fascinating.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you. This was really fun. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was.
Thank you so much.
It was great.
That conversation could have gone on for at least another hour. At least I had so many questions.
I was just going to say I had 20 more questions to ask. Yeah.
Yes, so many questions and every kind of bits of information. I had a million branches shooting off in all directions with a million questions that will shoot off into a million other questions. And, and I love academics because they kind of have the answers,
Yeah. And actually, there was such a richness in conversation that we had to cut out some of the back and forth and the Q&A, and we put it on Patreon. So if you want more of this, you should go and check out Patreon in a little bit, and we will be able to put some more information up there for you. In terms of takeaways, a few things stuck out for me. Number one is just recognizing, even in the way we were asking questions, how hard it is for us to believe that so much of what we want is actually a part of our source code and default settings. Because we kept being like, but what about this? But what about that?
Yes. I mean, I've been a believer on this for such a long time. That we have source code conversations for, we've been having source code conversations for a long time. And I've been a huge believer, follower, learner, student of evolutionary psychology, and it comes up in my coaching. I explain to people some of this wiring, like how some of these decisions are actually affected by their wiring for a long, long time. And this conversation just made me an even more of an avid believer, learner, more curious about evolutionary psychology. So absolutely.
Yeah. I think it gives rationale, explanation, even, some permission and spaces to not be so hard on ourselves. I one of the things that stuck out for me was his example around jealousy and naming it as really our effort to try to retain our resources. And I never thought about it that way. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. That if we think that those resources of love, attention, finances, comfort, safety, all the things, if those things are limited, then I don't want that shared with somebody else, because that means I'm going to get less of it. So that makes sense then why I get so territorial. So I think that was helpful in terms of explanation. And I think it helps us then be mindful. If we want to do something different, it doesn't mean that default setting is the absolute predictor of our behavior. It means that if we don't do anything else, we're going to default. And we have the possibility and ability to say, actually, I don't want to show up as jealous, or actually, I do want to be in multiple partnerships, or actually, I don't want to allow my hip to waist ratio to decide. Exactly. As I'm swiping on Tinder, I don't want symmetry to be the thing that I'm most focused on. That I think with this information, we have the ability then to be more mindful.
Yes, exactly. And also, this evolution has been happening for over 6 million years. 6 million years ago, our lives look very, very different. So our modern lives is not in any way representation of our evolutionary times. So I think what we think is what we think we need to feel safe and feel loved and all those things come from a long, long time ago. So I think there is an opportunity for us to realize the difference between what we're wired for versus the life that we created today.
Yeah. I think my last takeaway is that nature versus nurture is a stupid question. to stop asking.
That's a good one. Yeah.
We have a few social scientists that we're going to be interviewing in the next few weeks. And so note to self, don't
ask that question. Yeah.
But I appreciated that he was like, yes, it is both, but it's not both. Like they exist in combination with each other.
Yeah.
Let's not separate them.
With each other.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that absolutely makes sense to me. I think going back to, my takeaway is going back to what we're saying that our, modern life, being so different, also not so much, right? That even though fashion changes, the concept of beauty changes, we still go back to very primitive ways of thinking about what's attractive. And it's almost like we just call it by another name, but it is kind of the same. So that I thought was really interesting, because in my mind, that was definitely something that kept coming up, saying, I hear you, and then there's all these changes in what we, the beauty standards, right? But not really. They kind of apparently are the same.
And I want to, we need to fund this. I know we've talked about this before, but we need to take up a collection, and pay scientists to study things outside of heteronormative, cis relationship structures. Because I would like to know what this means in terms of queer communities. And I would like to know how this relates to non-monogamy and, polycule. Like, I want to know these things.
Yes.
So come on, folks, let's figure out how to make that happen.
I think we should have put into our vision board a fund that we make accessible to researchers who is doing that stuff, so they can apply for grants and funding, and we can provide that for the world. So I want to put that in our vision for the future, for Curious Fox funded research, for sure. The last bit for me is, I walk away wondering if it's worth challenging the default, if our joy lives in our choices that are aligned with our evolution, right? We talk a lot about challenging the status quo here and challenging the defaults. And that is still instinctively, I think there's so much richness and growth and learning that. And, and now I also walk away curious, is that also where our joy is? Is there something about allowing our choices to align with our evolution, which will also get us to a place of joy and delight and comfort?
I hear that. I think I see it differently in that I think that evolution requires variation, right? Or we would all still be the single-celled organisms that were floating around in the water. Thinking about evolution in terms of health and like the safety of of procreation, right? That's why like incest is so damaging, because we actually need variation in the genes. And so I don't know. I think that maybe our survival and even our joy requires us to step off the prescribed path or even the evolutionary path every now and then.
Yeah, I mean that's my instinct, right? That's why we do what we do, and that's why here's this podcast. Here's the way we choose to live our lives day to day. I think that still remains as my instinct, and I think that what I find that in itself is where I find joy and interests and richness. And I walk away wondering, is it just going to be easier and more fun if I just went with the flow? I
feel like that's a recurring theme in our self-reflection is like, do things need to be as hard as I'm making them? I think that's really the question. Why is everything so difficult? Sounds like it doesn't need to be. Yeah, but we want to, if you're trying to do something different, live creatively, live also really mindfully and thoughtfully. And I don't mean that to say that folks who are in more traditional relationship constructs and stuff are not living thoughtfully and mindfully, but I'm sure there are so many ways and folks need to undo some of the thinking that they've had around race, around intersectionality, around gender identity, around work, around beauty. Right, exactly. That we all are unraveling and unpacking. Why do we do and think the things that we do? And is there another way of being? And so, let's continue to be on that journey. More informed now, but let's be on the journey nonetheless.
Yes.
You can find out more about Adar Eisenbruch and review his recent publications by going onto his website, adareisenbruch.com. And while you're online, check us out on our website or on Instagram or on Facebook, all under the name We Are Curious Foxes. We are working to increase our reach and we need your help. So please share our podcast episodes with friends, rate the show, leave a comment, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, or follow us on Spotify or Stitcher. And if you want to continue to indulge your curiosity, then join us on Patreon at We Are Curious Foxes, where you can find behind the scenes footage, mini episodes, over 50 videos of educator-led workshops, and some things that we had to cut from this episode and that we saved just for our Patreon members. Go on to Patreon at We Are Curious Foxes. And then let us know that you are listening. Share a comment, a story, or a question by emailing us or sending us a voice memo to listening@wearecuriousfoxes.com. Or you can record a question for the show by calling us at 201-870-0063.
This episode is produced and edited by Nina Pollock, who has helped us evolve this podcast from recordings in Brooklyn basements to over 75,000 earbuds across the globe. Our intro music is composed by Dave Saha. We are so grateful for their work, and we're grateful to you for listening. As always, stay curious, friends. Curious Fox Podcast is not and will never be the final word on any topic. We solely aim to encourage curiosity and provide a space for exploration through connection and story. We encourage you to listen with an open and curious mind, and we'll look forward to your feedback. Stay curious, friends.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.